Good evening and welcome. The community awareness event you're participating in tonight was coordinated by members of the Leadership Putnam class of 2020. Lisa Coble, Planet Technologies; Sarah Wilson, America Bank and Trust of the Cumberlands; Brandon Burr, One Bank of Tennessee; Sammy Talent, Averitt Express; Matthew Nisbet, Tennessee Tech University; and Taylor Asbury, Progressive Tax and Accounting. Leadership Putnam is a 501c3 organization that provides in-depth seminars on a variety of community-related topics for its participants. Each year, Leadership Putnam class members complete a series of projects aimed at meeting a need within the community. Our discussion tonight is a result of one of those projects. We will focus on raising awareness of a quiet but sinister concern in communities across our nation: human trafficking. The Department of Homeland Security defines human trafficking as a criminal activity that involves the use of force, fraud, coercion to obtain some type of labor or commercial sex act. Traffickers might use violence, manipulation, or false promise of well-paying jobs or romantic relationship to lure victims into trafficking situations. According to the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, human trafficking is one of the fastest growing criminal enterprises, second to only drug trafficking. Tonight, we are joined by panelists Margie Quinn, Bryant Dunaway, and Linda Loftus. They will share their expertise on recognizing red flags, community statistics, the comorbidity of substance abuse, victim recovery, and more. The event will end with a question and answer session during which our panelists will answer questions submitted by our viewers. I'd like to introduce our panelists that we're very thankful to have this evening. Margie Quinn is the CEO, End Slavery Tennessee. Margie retired as an assistant special agent in charge from the TBI in 2018 after 26 years of service in law enforcement. In the past, she directed the statewide Amber Alert program as well as the Missing Children's Clearinghouse. In 2015, Margie was tapped to develop and oversee the creation of the first ever statewide human trafficking investigative unit at the TBI. She conceived and led 12 major undercover sting operations designed to identify the traffic and arrest the traffickers. Currently, Margie is the executive director of End Slavery Tennessee, a 501c3 nonprofit. Bryant Dunaway. Bryant Dunaway was elected District Attorney General for the 13th Judicial District on August 7, 2014, and assumed the office on September 1, 2014. The Office of District Attorney General for the 13th Judicial District serves 7 counties in the Upper Cumberland region, including Clay, Cumberland, DeKalb, Overton, Pickett, Putnam, and White counties. General Dunaway currently serves as the chairman of the board of both the 13th Judicial District Drug and Violent Crimes Task Force and Upper Cumberland Family Justice Center. Linda Loftus Webb. Linda began her career working in mental health, where she worked extensively with schizoaffective disorders and post-traumatic stress disorders, PTSD. She worked for Bradford Health Services as a counselor, Lifeline Projects as a CPRS, and Recovery Court as an executive director for more than 15 years combined, where she was recognized as an expert in the field of substance treatment. Linda founded Independence Again, a 501c3 nonprofit to help provide a holistic, sober option for highly motivated individuals who have a strong desire to find a new lifestyle. Linda was recognized by Governor Bill Lee on her 25th sobriety date, December 13, 2019, for appreciation and recognition of outstanding service in the best interests and the highest traditions of the state of Tennessee. You can look on the Facebook page if you need more extensive bios on our guest speakers. We're going to go ahead and start and welcome again Margie and just let her go over a few things that she knows about the trafficking world.
Thank you. And thanks so much to Leadership Putnam for hosting this forum and for inviting us to participate. Trafficking is a very, as they said, quiet, hidden crime that's occurring here in the state of Tennessee. I began working on trafficking in my capacity with the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation in 2007-2008 when we began to understand that some of our runaway children, our missing children, were being trafficked in the state. In 2010, the Tennessee General Assembly passed a public chapter that called for a quantitative and qualitative study to be conducted on trafficking. They wanted to pass new laws, but wanted to make sure that they were passing laws the way we needed and addressed the things that we needed in the state. And so the TBI partnered with Vanderbilt Center for Community Studies and conducted a mixed methods research project, which we then returned the results of in 2011. You can see that report still on TBI's outreach website, ithastostop.com. It's called Tennessee Human Sex Trafficking and its Impact on Children and Youth. And in order to quantify trafficking in the state across the 95 counties, surveys were sent out to all law enforcement, the Department of Children's Services, court clerks, juvenile court clerks, guardian ad litems. We also conducted focus group meetings across the state with subject matter experts, and then we profiled 3 cases of trafficking of children here in the state of Tennessee. I think it's important to start out tonight by saying those original reports and those original studies found a report of 16 to 25 cases of minor human sex trafficking. That's the sex trafficking of persons under the age of 18. So 16 to 25 of those were reported in Putnam County from state and local officials. 6 to 15 cases of adult trafficking. And in your surrounding counties, Clay, Jackson, Overton, and White, 1 to 5 cases of juvenile sex trafficking. So that's what was being reported in 2010, 2011, I think before we really even understood what trafficking was. In Slavery, Tennessee came along about 2012, started as a training, outreach, education nonprofit, and then along about 2013, 2014 started direct services to victims of trafficking. We are now part of the Tennessee Anti-Slavery Alliance, where we cover all 95 counties in the state of Tennessee. In Slavery, Tennessee is covering 41 of those counties in Middle Tennessee by offering services to victims and working with community partners who are also working with trafficked victims and addicted victims. And so we are responsive to law enforcement. We participate with law enforcement on trafficking stings where victims are recovered. And we still do some training, outreach, and advocacy and act as subject matter experts with the legislature regarding new policy and new laws. That's a little bit of the background and history of, I think, trafficking in Tennessee and what In Slavery is doing here in Middle Tennessee.
Great. Thank you so much. Bryant, we'll move to you next.
Yeah, well, thank you for the invitation to be part of the panel tonight. So I guess I'll describe to you just a little bit of the experiences of my judicial district, which includes the 7 counties you already mentioned earlier today. That's really my focus as the district attorney for the 13th Judicial District. And I would tell you that to understand human trafficking, it's kind of, in layman's terms, the term human trafficking is a broad term. It encompasses several different types of activities, for lack of a better word. And the statutes tell us that human trafficking involves offenses that, the criminal offenses of involuntary servitude, trafficking for commercial sex acts, and trafficking for labor, and also the promotion of prostitution in certain instances. So I think that my observation is that how human trafficking looks is maybe a little bit different from region to region. But I'll speak to some of the specific examples that we see here in the Upper Cumberland, and specifically this judicial district. We do have human trafficking here. Many people are surprised to learn that. I would say that if you characterize it broadly, most of the human trafficking, not all, but most in this area is related to sexual acts. For example, and that comes in different scenarios or circumstances. Children are often preyed upon. We have investigations currently in this judicial district where children, teenage girls, most of the time, not all the time, most of the time, are solicited, groomed, and taken into the business of prostitution. And they're often controlled by the use of and providing with narcotics and drugs so that they can better control those children. And then they are utilized in the sex traffic trade, and that's a real presence here in the 13th Judicial District of Upper Cumberland. Other examples of sex-related human trafficking. I say sex-related because it's really, by definition, labor. But we've had experiences here with spas where you have workers who may be working in the sex trade but are actually being forced into labor to work, long hours, no pay, or little to no pay, and they are just forced into that type of work. They may be doing it voluntarily and knowing what they're doing as far as the nature of that work, but the labor that they're being forced or coerced into doing for many different reasons is human trafficking by definition. In this community, we have conducted stings. I mentioned to you that human trafficking includes the promotion of prostitution. Now, there's been a really different view of prostitution. There's been a change of that over the years. In years past and historically, there was a lot of effort by law enforcement to arrest the prostitute. And I think we've all gotten wiser over the years and realized that it is often the prostitute who's the victim and victimized and find themselves in that line of work because they've been coerced or forced into that type of work. And so law enforcement now focuses more on the customers or the people who desire that type of work. So right here in our judicial district, we've conducted, with the help of TBI and all the local law enforcement agencies, Cookeville Police Department, Putnam County Sheriff's Department, and others, a human trafficking sting. And we do that by posting, and have done it, by posting advertisements on places like the former Backpage.com and saying, hey, I am a 14-year-old young lady and I'm offering myself to you, and you would be shocked. The public would be shocked to literally watch them swarm the hotel. They came from places as far as out of state or Nashville or across town. And they all came in here, and they have the intent to have sexual relations with a child. And when they got here, they found themselves under arrest. So the general public, where none of us are surprised that there's a drug problem in our communities, that's kind of a common thing, and we are familiar with violent crimes. But one of the things that would be most shocking to the general public is the volume of child sex abuse and human trafficking. So much so that I have dedicated prosecutors in my office that handle just those types of cases and no other kind of case. Those are some examples of what we see right here in our community. It's not speculation. It happens somewhere else. Those are real life examples of some of the investigations that we have dealt with right here.
Thanks, Brian. Linda, would you tell us a little bit about Independence Again and the assistance that you guys offer and what you all do?
So I am the founder of Independence Again, and we began a few years ago to work with some of the trafficking courts because we're a therapeutic program. So all of our residents are required to attend some level of therapy, whatever is appropriate for them. And that was attractive to our community partners that we work with because, unfortunately, every one of our young ladies who have been trafficked have some level of PTSD, ranging anywhere from moderate controlled to severe and not controlled PTSD. So what we do is we work on getting them into the appropriate level of care. We also work on making sure they get into a stable work environment so that they can get back to society in a way that is healthy for them and builds their self-esteem, rather than a career that would leave them with more trauma. Some of the things that we also focus on with our human trafficking residents is looking at getting them back to their children. Some of the other coercions that some of our ladies have endured due to their circumstances is they've been separated from their children in order to work, and that's how they were forced to continue to work. And then others were used with drug addiction and other things of that nature. There's no telling how far someone's trauma could go because of the human trafficking. Now, Independence Again, we have 3 locations here in Putnam County, and we specialize with mental health and substance use. We don't just work with just substance use or just mental health. And not all of our residents are trafficked victims, However, all of our residents have one of two barriers, and that is mental health or substance use. We can at any time have up to 52 residents that are men with children in one location, and then we have 2 locations for women. One of our locations is women only, and then we also have one for women with children. And the reason we focus on getting the children back is because ultimately, at the end of the day, these young ladies and these young men, because it is not gender specific, they deserve the opportunity to be a functioning member of society, and unfortunately, that is not the way they have been treated. And we have to break that for them so that they can start to rebuild. Over the years, we have taken probably, based off of an estimate, about 120 applications on average a year of someone who would classify as a human trafficked resident when they apply. And some of them need lower level of care than what we offer, and some of them need higher. So we have to be very, very careful about making sure we don't do more harm by placing them in a level of care that's not productive for them, and that we don't put them in a position to where they're going to walk away before they've had an opportunity to work on healing. There is a reality. 25 to 40% of our residents who are in this circumstance, as well as domestic violence, will choose to return to the lifestyle because it is too difficult to make the change immediately. But what we do is we plant the seed so that they can know that there's always a place to turn back to, and knowing that they can come back if they need to has helped many residents come back either a second or a third time, and we have had success on that third go around. So, and thank you for having me.
Absolutely, thank you. We're going to do some question and answers here off of our Facebook. If anybody's out there and you guys have questions, if you want to go ahead and post them, now would be a good time. It looks like we do have a few of those, and I guess these are not specific. It doesn't look like to anyone on, so feel free to jump in and answer. The first question is, a growing concern of COVID-19 lockdowns has been the nationwide increase in human trafficking and abuse incidents. Can you share the effects at our state and local levels?
I can approach the solution part of it. We're having some barriers with hopelessness and things of that nature. With everyone being told social distancing and stay at home, it becomes a part of the mental health component where you have people who have been so socialized in one specific way, they struggle to change that behavior. And without that regular positive interaction with the support groups, some of our young people have been having a very, 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 very difficult time acclimating to the requests that we are making to get them into a healthier lifestyle. I know, so it's making it more difficult for them to make that shift emotionally and spiritually and physically into the healthier social boundaries.
I would say from the law enforcement and prosecution element, COVID has not stopped or slowed down investigations by law enforcement and investigators. Those continue to go on because they're just absolutely necessary. But what has slowed down somewhat is how those cases progress through the court system. The court system has not stopped during the COVID pandemic either. We've always held dockets and kept them going, but because of issues related to distancing and things, the trials have kind of slowed down and paused somewhat. For example, in this judicial district, we had a trial, we starting in February of 2020, was our last trial, and we just recommenced having jury trials this month. So there were several months there that jury trials weren't held because of the COVID dynamic. And so you ask, well, how does that affect things? Well, you know, defendants are entitled to have their cases moved through the court system, but so are victims. And so victims, it's never a good thing for victims when their case is not moving through the system at a good pace and comes to resolution in a reasonable amount of time. And so it is a little bit stressful for the victims in these cases to have. You can imagine the nature of the cases. They're often needed as witnesses in court, and so in that aspect, that's affected us and how the court system has slowed down a little bit.
So I think to kind of piggyback off of what Linda said, we also are seeing clients who have a sort of a heightened sense of hopelessness. I would also say that the lockdowns, while obviously make sense for COVID, feel very much like the control that a trafficker would place on a victim. And so that increases their level of anxiety, depression, and their ability to cope with their current circumstances. We've seen a lack of referrals, so referrals have slowed down. In 2019, we received 307 referrals for service. This year, we're at about 150. So we're probably going to experience about a third less referrals in 2020 as compared to 2019, which means that clients are not able to find their way to our services through the same means or mechanisms as they did before. Many of our partners have slowed down or shut down. Children are not in school. Not everybody is safer at home. So the places and locations where victims were being identified, which was a great thing, that's not happening, or that's happening at a much slower rate. And so, as the general said, I don't think the crime has stopped. We don't think the crime has stopped. The activity that we see across the internet is as robust as it was a year ago. But we're not getting the referrals. We're not seeing the clients come through our doors because of some of the barriers that COVID presents.
Well, thank you guys for those answers. We've got more questions coming in. It looks like we're about at the point to take about a 5-minute break. So we'll take a break here for about 5 minutes, and then we'll be back with more question and answers and positive things here. Thank you. Well, we're back, and we've got a few more questions here on Facebook that we would like to cover. And I guess to start, someone asked is, how often do you see addiction and trafficking go together, and how do those normally coincide with one another as you guys see cases?
Yeah, that's a great question. We mentioned the statute, and the statute does address that issue specifically. When drugs are used as a means of control, that is proof of trafficking. So I think the legislature is pretty clear about their intent to look at those two things as co-occurring. At In Slavery, Tennessee, in the last year and a half, about 70% of the clients that we're serving are opioid addicted. Many have multiple addictions. Very few are not drug users or addicts. And that's because drugs so often are used as either a means of control or as a means of coping with the complex trauma that they've experienced as trafficking victims. And so when we're talking about a holistic approach to treating or delivering services to a client, we're talking about therapeutic interventions, we're talking about addiction recovery, talking about complex trauma therapy. If you are just dealing with one of those issues, that's not a recipe for success. So in other words, if you're just doing addiction recovery, at the end of the day, you're going to have a really traumatized, a sober person, and that's not going to work. I'm sure Linda has seen the same things.
Definitely, it's definitely not sustainable unless we work on both barriers at exactly the same time, in conjunction in a therapeutic way. So that way, as they're healing physically and emotionally, they're also healing that addiction in conjunction with that, because it is too difficult to face reality if you're not addressing why the trauma is there in the first place. And sometimes it's like an onion, you have to peel back the layers in order to be successful at addressing that addiction. And one thing I will add, it's not a one-time and done deal for any of our residents and any of the young ladies and young men that have been trafficked, because it could be just a sight or a smell or anything like that, and it can go back to where they feel like it's easier to use and not feel in that moment. And then we just pick up, start over, work on that barrier, whatever happened, and then we continue to move on for solutions in a positive way.
From my perspective, we certainly see drugs involved in human trafficking quite often. And we've mentioned the control. Margie mentioned the control. That's certainly been used, with the intent with victims. Usually vulnerable people are targeted for human trafficking. And they're vulnerable to begin with. They're sought out. And then often they're provided with drugs, and if they're not already dealing with substance abuse issues, then they're provided drugs so that they acquire substance abuse issues, and then they're controlled, and then they develop a dependence on the people that are providing it, and it just complicates the issue much more. But another aspect of it that we've seen in our communities where drugs is involved, and this is heartbreaking, but we've had instances where we have addicted parents of children, where they're addicted to opiates or methamphetamine, and they are actually promoting prostitution using their own children to acquire drugs or money for drugs. And so that's just heartbreaking. And so those are two real examples that we see here, or we have seen here in our community, where drugs are involved in a very real way.
In that secondary trafficked barrier, I know with the ladies and men that I've worked with, some of the folks can tell me that their parents entered them into this lifestyle as early as 6, 7, 8, and they didn't view it as problematic until they were arrested or until they were passed on from the family member to the strangers in the community. And that was when they started saying, this is probably not the way every other child lives. And we see that, unfortunately, more often than anyone would like to see.
When you talk about normalizing abuse, sexual abuse at a very young age, when it's introduced at 4, 5, 6 years old, which some of our clients have told us, that kind of normalized behavior sets a child up on a trajectory towards all kinds of addiction issues, domestic violence, intimate partner violence, trafficking, commercial sex. And we talk about ACEs scores, the adverse childhood experiences. All of those experiences as a child build and build and build. It's what makes it that complex trauma. It's extremely complicated to try to peel back those layers. And then once you get to a 20-year-old or 25-year-old who's been in abuse since they were very young, that's where you end up with somebody who's extremely addicted, maybe out there as a sort of what we call a prostitute, but they have this very long history of abuse and victimization, and as the general said, creates extreme vulnerabilities in somebody which are exploitable, unfortunately, as trafficking.
You guys talked a little bit ago, and I don't think went into depth, but there are obviously, with drugs and that lifestyle, health issues that come into play, and I know you touched on, life expectancy and things like that. You want to touch on just how that not only affects your mental health, but just your physical health, and just when you see people, what are some of the things these people that are involved in this are facing on a physical standpoint, not only the mental and emotional.
Well, I know when you take in drug addiction or take into account drug addiction, it can shorten anyone's lifespan. With the level of addiction for heroin, for example, overdose is, there's a saying we have in the therapeutic circles, it's not if, it's when someone's going to overdose with heroin. And there's bad heroin. Like, I don't know how much bad heroin there is, but there's bad heroin out there. So that could be what we call a hot shot, where someone gets the bad drugs and they don't wake up. And there are laws that protect people if they take them to the hospital, but in a human traffic situation, they're not going to the hospital. No one's taking them because that's not covered, and things of that nature. But then you also have the medical issues with sexually transmitted diseases, and then you also have other issues where you have poor nutrition, poor diet. They're working sometimes 36 hours straight, and that's just not a healthy lifestyle for our young folks. Nobody can sustain that long term, not even with methamphetamine and things of that nature. So you have all those issues with heart conditions, and almost every one of our ladies who've entered into our program who were IV drug users, which inevitably heroin is, have had hepatitis C, which destroys the liver. They've had other comorbid medical issues, diabetes and things of that nature. So their life expectancy plummets drastically. So.
Yeah, when you talk about children being introduced into sex trafficking or chronic and longitudinal child sexual abuse, children their bodies are not built to withstand that kind of abuse. So if you see a 13, 14, 15-year-old, and the average age of the juvenile client that we're serving is 15, when they're having forced sex with 4, 6, 8, 10 men a day over an extended period of time, that's going to create pretty extreme medical issues. As you said, lack of nutrition, sleep deprivation creates extreme paranoia. Mental health and mental illness issues are going to come to the fore, and so they're going to have a whole host of issues. We have also taken in victims who have experienced extreme violence from their trafficker, so gunshot wounds, extreme beatings, lacerated spleens, stabbings. We are our clients are experiencing extreme violence beyond what just the trafficking does. They're also experiencing violence at the hands of their trafficker.
Another question that was sent is, Cookeville and Putnam County are ideally situated in close proximity to Nashville, Knoxville, and I-40. We're also surrounded by rural areas encompassing many nurseries and farms. Though generally seen as a positive, does our location put us at a higher risk for trafficking activity?
I think that specifically our communities, it is easy to travel here. We have crossing I-40 east and west, 111 north and south, and 111 all goes down to Nashville and on to Atlanta. It's easy for drug trafficking and human trafficking to travel this region. I think there's also a perception that we are still somewhat of a rural area and somewhat invisible, in some regards. So, and unseen. So you maybe that the activity can go undetected maybe a little bit longer than it would in an urban area. That's a factor as well. I think all of those working together certainly brings it. I'll tell you, with the example I gave earlier with the human trafficking sting we did, it didn't matter that Cookeville was, the location of the sting was 5 miles away or 180 miles away. They swarmed to us and in large numbers. We would look out the window and literally see them driving through the parking lot, and many of them come in. So location, rural area, I think all of that plays into a unique circumstance.
One of the things we haven't talked about was the role that poverty plays in leading children into trafficking or adults into addiction. If you have areas of Putnam County or surrounding counties where there is extreme poverty, where children are living below the poverty level, that creates a vulnerability that is exploitable for a trafficker. In the introduction, you said that I participated in and led 12 undercover trafficking stings before I retired from the TBI. And just to sort of support what the general said, I can recall a sting where there were men literally lined up in the hallway. In my 26 years in law enforcement, I have never seen anything like it. We were just astounded, and I think every time they probably still run one, it's just surprising. It's just shocking that men will, travel as far as they'll travel to pay to have sex with a kid, and know that's what they're coming for. And so when you have demand, and we haven't really talked about demand, trafficking is a demand-driven crime. This is not a supply problem. And so that's why I think you've seen those incredible reductions in numbers across the state for prostitution arrests, 65% since 2014. It's because law enforcement and the criminal justice system, I think, has finally come to the realization, and I lumped myself into that category too back then, that it is not productive to continue to arrest the same woman 70 times. We have to go after the men who are buying her. And so, because typically these men have something to lose. And so if you are going to impact or correct behavior, and that's what we're aiming for, we want to impact behavior, change behavior, we have to go after demand and the people who are promoting. Increase the penalties and increase the likelihood that they're going to get caught. Because the deacon at the church or the small business owner, or the public official can't get caught doing this. And so if they think the likelihood that they're going to be caught is increasing exponentially, there's an opportunity for us to change that behavior. They may say, you know what, it's just not worth it. And then they don't commit that kind of crime.
So we constantly hear human trafficking compared to drug trafficking. Can you explain why human trafficking is more lucrative than drug trafficking?
Well, from my perspective, my girls can be sold 7 times, 12 times. I think I've had one young lady who actually came out of one of our trafficking courts. She said the busiest she was ever was 26 times in one day, and that was extensive. So that's 26 times one thing is being sold, which is the sex act itself, whereas drugs, it's a one and done. So if I'm selling, I have a very specific amount of drugs on me, and I can sell that one time. Whereas this young lady, as long as she's awake, and sometimes not even then, she's a commodity at that point. Her body is a commodity. And one thing I will say also, there's premium rates for some guys if they're allowed to hit her. There's some premium rates if they're allowed to rough her up or choke her or him, or if they're allowed to do multiple sex acts in multiple different ways that are violent in nature, and that's a premium price. So if I'm buying heroin, there's a going rate for heroin, and that's how much I'm getting. If I'm selling someone's body and I want to do this, and this, that's stacking the price. So it can be a very, very lucrative option.
The next question I think probably ties into that really well, and it is how do human traffickers target their victims? So obviously it's a lucrative business, but how are they finding those people, and what is kind of the general?
Well, so that could be answered in many different ways. I'll speak to the commercial sex trafficking or aspect of it. In my experience, and this is a commentary for all of us parents out there, when you're dealing with young children, teenage girls mostly, as you mentioned earlier, certainly male children are victims as well, but for the most part, the majority are females. They're vulnerable, and the groomer looks for those vulnerable children, and often, where do you think that is? It's online, through social media, through websites, through all these multiple apps that most parents are oblivious to, and they begin a grooming process, and a trust is built, and then a meeting is arranged, and then they're snatched up and taken off to a terrible place, and then they're provided the narcotics that leads into the control, and then the multiple Johns are coming through the hotel room in just a matter of a day or two. So parents, if you're not paying attention to your children's online internet activity, you're making a grave error. It is, in today's world, I'm glad I grew up before the age of the internet and cell phones, because it is a much more difficult place to parent and monitor your children's activities. And don't think because you live in because you may not be in poverty that your children are not susceptible to this. All of them are, if they are dealing with any kind of emotional distress or whatever. It's easy to recognize a vulnerable child, and they are the ones that are sought after. They're the easiest ones to groom and to reel in, and it's just a reality.
The general's exactly right. Facebook is the #1 recruiting tool right now. I always say, if you won't let your kid go out here and play on I-40 in rush hour, you shouldn't let them play on the internet either. It is every bit as dangerous.
Now, we only work with adults, and they're not allowed to be on Facebook.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just, and TikTok is just as bad, and there's some others, I don't even know what they're called, because we just don't allow it. It's just, it is a breeding ground for unhealthy boundaries with people. It is a breeding ground for unhealthy social interactions. And it only takes 1 minute where they feel defeated in a situation. Maybe they got fired from work, or they showed up late and got yelled at from their boss, and they're not used to that level of commitment. And then they get on Facebook and say, I can't believe my boss did this. I got into trouble at work. And then these professional groomers get on there and be like, oh my goodness, I can't believe you're having to do this. And then they give them that unhealthy feedback that's normal to them. And then they're right back emotionally where they were 5 seconds before they came in the door. And it takes another 3 months to get them back to a healthy place.
Next question is, I'm from San Diego, and at that is a large city because of its port, a border city. Has professional sports teams, large population of foster youth, large homeless population, etc. I now live in Cookeville. What makes Nashville and surrounding areas a target for human traffickers?
I don't think it's a target. I think it's everywhere. I think it's just everywhere there's demand, there's trafficking. And I think the general has said it really well. Demand drives this crime, and it's here in the Upper Cumberland just like it is in Nashville. It may be exponentially a smaller group of people doing it, but you have a smaller population. So it's all relative to population and influx of people.
And in a smaller town, it's going to be more controlled and more hidden because it's less normalized. Mm-hmm. Like if you see someone walking around downtown Cookeville, which is a fairly small town, dressed inappropriately, you're probably going to have 15, 20 people say something about that. You see someone walking around in the same outfit next to nightclubs and things that are supportive of those types of outfits, no one's thinking anything of it. So there's definitely the level of acceptance with certain things, but again, it's supply and demand. Big cities, small city, it's about the same.
Looks like we have just a couple more. Backpage.com was finally shut down as a part of an enforcement action by the FBI, the U.S. Postal Inspection Service, and IRS Criminal Investigation Division in 2018. Why was this site that openly trafficked humans, including children, allowed to legally operate for so long? Why was it so difficult to shut it down? Yes, Backpage.com now exists, and I'm able to go straight to a Nashville site. Are there any law enforcement attempts happening to shut down this site or others like it?
So in 2013, the legislature passed a law which made it a Class C felony for an internet provider to advertise a trafficked person. Backpage immediately enjoined that law. I wrote the affidavit in support of that legislation, and ultimately the Middle District of Tennessee found that to be unconstitutional and a violation of the CDA 230. That's the Communications Decency Act 230. You're probably seeing it a lot in the news. I know President Trump is talking a lot about it, and the pervasiveness that it allows the internet service providers to operate with relative impunity. I would say that our Senator Marsha Blackburn was very instrumental in pressing for changes to the CDA, which allowed law enforcement to go after the Backpage.com. There are, as with anything, once you created that void, because Backpage was absolutely the biggest purveyor of sex advertising in the United States. Many sources estimated that they were making upwards of $40 million a year just off sex advertising alone. The analysis that we did in the state of Tennessee when I was in the Fusion Center suggested that there were around 85,000 ads running every single year just in the state of Tennessee. Those ads cost anywhere from $1 to $5 an ad. It's a lot of ads to make $40 million. Once those exceptions were carved out of the CDA, law enforcement was able to target Backpage. That created a void, and so you have a lot of other internet providers coming up. FBI shut down City Guide last month, but it's sort of like playing whack-a-mole. Every time you whack one, another one pops up. It's just so cheap. It's just so anonymous. When I was with the TBI, we were constantly chasing things like Bitcoin and how to get the advertisements up. As the general talked about, putting the advertisement up. It's really operating in a really covert way, and it's just sort of a constant chase of the bad guy.
That's a good characterization. Technology changes so fast. We all know that. It's part of our lives, and frankly, the law doesn't change that fast. And we're always trying to catch up with and modify our techniques and the laws and try to update them and keep up with the way we live in this technology world. And it's a really big feat and hard to do.
And where there's a will, there's a way. I mean, some of these predators are so manipulative and so creative. If they used them for good, it would be we would probably be able to solve all kinds of problems in our world.
Two more questions. One from YouTube was, how is the legalization going to affect trafficking? I would assume legalization of maybe marijuana and some other drugs.
I think they're talking about prostitution.
Prostitution.
There's a big movement afoot to legalize prostitution and what they call sex work. The legalized exploitation of women and children and men is not where we want to be, I don't think. I think we at least at End Slavery Tennessee stand firmly opposed to legalizing the systematic exploitation and oppression of women and children.
Yeah, it is not empowering our bodies.
No.
It's just not. I would love to think that it would be in some reality, but that is just not the case.
Yeah.
And legalizing prostitution or any form of sex trafficking or sex acts normalizes that in the next step, and it would just become problematic. For therapeutically, it would be just a tragedy all the way across the board therapeutically.
Besides the fact it's morally wrong.
Yeah. There you go.
There's that.
There is that too.
I think we would more fall in line under sort of what we would call the Nordic model, and if folks want to look that up, and that's where you use prosecutorial discretion to go after the promoters and the buyers rather than the women who have so often been victimized. And that's sort of the theory behind the Nordic model. And I think we're kind of unofficially doing that now. And I think that's a great place to put discretion, is in a prosecutor's hands.
And I think this last question is really good, and it is, what can the public do to help fight against trafficking? What can we do as citizens and part of the community?
So that's a really great question, and that what I'm about to suggest to you applies to not just human trafficking, but a lot of things. So if you're walking through the world, just keep your eyes and ears up. Be aware of what's going on around you. We even preach that to law enforcement. Our law enforcement investigators and uniformed police officers on the road, we're training now to try to recognize the warning signs of human trafficking. For example, a highway patrolman, a trooper stops a car on the interstate for speeding, and the occupants of that car are one adult male in his 50s and three teenage-looking girls, and they have an out-of-state tag, and they tell the trooper that they're traveling to see friends from Texas, and they don't have a single suitcase in the car. I mean, that doesn't mean that anything is going illegal, but it's a red flag that maybe there's something going on here that's just not right. Maybe these young ladies in the back seat of the car, they just don't fit. Something's not right. And so just being aware and reporting those things. If you see children who are acting out sexually inappropriately at age 2 or 4, that doesn't mean necessarily there's something wrong, but it's certainly something that's a red flag where something could be happening. Eyes and ears, and report it to law enforcement investigators will be the best thing the public can do.
Well, on behalf of Leadership Putnam, we would like to close tonight by thanking our panelists. We couldn't have done this without your guys' giving join us and to attempt to help our community. We really appreciate your time and your efforts to come spend with us. We'd like to also thank WCTE and the Biz Foundry for their support in streaming this event to you live. And for more information regarding human trafficking and ways to help, make sure you please visit End Slavery, which is www.endslaverytn.org. It Has to Stop, which is www.ithastostop.com. Independence Again is www.independenceagain.org. And also the Tennessee Human Trafficking Hotline is 1-855-558-6484, or text Be Free to 233-733. And again, we'd like to thank everybody for joining us. Thank you for your time. And again, thank you to our panelists for your time and efforts. Have a good evening.
Thank you.